Hello learners, welcome to this online study session on the Scarlet Letter. I am Vaishali Sharma from the Department of English, University of Delhi, and in this online study session we will be looking at the psychological significance in the novel and how Hawthorne presents himself as a psychologist, how he carves his characters, and overall the novel functions as a psychological fiction, which was quite a new domain in the mid-19th century America. Even though the book often introduces allegorical or partly allegorical characters and depends on old-fashioned personifications and other techniques to bring out inner truths, the very fact that it is concerned with inner truth puts it at the forefront of the development of psychological fiction. In this recognition of the hidden life and his description of mental processes, Hawthorne was a psychologist ahead of his time. Psychological speculation is as old as Aristotle, but the idea of a scientific analytical psychology was new in the 19th century, and there did not yet exist the rich array of concepts, the wide vocabulary, and the accumulation of data that would later develop. This is why Hawthorne was apt to depend on outmoded literary techniques for representing some of his insight into mental states and processes. Moreover, since science in his time was intensely materialistic in its approach, he probably meant to suggest, by using old-fashioned rhetoric, that some important human truths known to earlier generations had been lost sight of in the positivist intellectual orientation of contemporary scientific thought. For such an implication, outdated language and techniques would be quite fitting. Even so, however, certain elements of the psychological representation in the Scarlet Letter are strikingly innovative and advanced and liable to be overlooked if we succumb entirely to the novel's intentional archaisms. For example, it is an advanced idea to split the inner life fundamentally from the outer, as Hawthorne does in the cases of Hester and Dimmesdale, and at the same time to place the key to identity in the thoughts, emotions, and fantasies of these characters rather than their behavior. Today, this idea is commonplace. In Hawthorne's time, it was not, and the novel as a genre was taking the lead in investigating the interior of a heart, as Hawthorne's chapter title describes it. The vast increase in awareness of and attention to the interior world was an offshoot of the general romantic movement with its tremendous focus on the single self. Among intellectual forms, fiction was especially well suited to treat the concept in depth and with detailed examples. But along with a stress on the mental life of his major characters, which he shares with many other novelists of his time, Hawthorne offers us other, more personal psychological insights. He suggests the existence not exactly of a single unified unconscious as Freud was to hypothesize, but certainly of continual unconscious thought processes with accompanying defenses and rationalizations on the part of the conscious mind as it seeks to contain while pretending not to know its deeper layers. But along with the stress on the mental life of his major characters, which he shares with many other novelists of his time, Hawthorne offers us other more personal psychological insights. He suggests the existence not exactly of a single unified unconscious as Freud was to hypothesize, but certainly of continual unconscious thought processes with accompanying defenses and rationalizations on the part of the conscious mind as it seeks to contain while pretending not to know its deeper layers. The usual hidden unconscious becomes visible in periods of mental conflict and also in states of unusual excitement. Important scenes in the Scarlet Letter show Hester or Dimmesdale at such times. The first episode of extreme mental stimulation occurs at the beginning of the story when Hester is exposed on the scaffold. After describing her from the outside as she appeared to the Puritan multitude and as she might have appeared to a cultural outsider, the narrator moves into her mind and follows her own currents of thought. Her mind, and especially her memory, was active and kept bringing up other scenes than this, one picture precisely as vivid as another, as if all were of similar importance or all alike a play. Possibly it was an instinctive device of her spirit to relive itself by the exhibition of these forms from the cruel weight and hardness of the reality. Here Hester's mind seems out of control, or rather the conscious mind is simply a screen on which another deeper mind, an instinctive device of a spirit, is casting its images. At times of enormous stress, the controlling mind gives way to reveal the presence of layers of usually obscured, or to use a modern term, repressed mental activity. As a character distinguished, however, by striking self-control, Hester does not often succumb to eruptions of the unconscious in this manner. Her conscious mind is occupied nonetheless with excluding unacceptable thoughts from its precincts. In devoting so much of her needlecraft to creating coarse garments for the poor, the narrator suggests it is probable that there was an idea of penance, which however was morbid, betokening something doubtful, something that might be deeply wrong beneath. The word beneath here divides the mind into layers and identifies the centers of the psyche, not in surface rationality, but in the hidden desires beneath, thus portioning mental life into conscious and unconscious layers, as Freud was to do half a century later. Earlier, in the same chapter, Hawthorne had attempted to explain why, with the world before her, Hester chose to stay in Boston, and here he distinguishes even more carefully between surface explanation, what the mind tells itself, and the true explanation, which, because it does not suit one's self-image, the mind rejects. It might be too doubtless it was so. Although she hid the secret from herself and grew pale whenever it struggled out of her heart, like a serpent from its hole, it might be that another feeling kept her. She barely looked the idea in the face and hastened to bar it in its dungeon. What she compelled herself to believe, what finally she reasoned upon as her motive for continuing a resident of New England, was half a truth and half a self-delusion. What is this idea, this feeling? Simply that she continues to love Dimmesdale and to hope that somehow circumstances will bring them together. This is one of the striking early instances in literature of the depiction of the mind as a divided space and of the processes of rationalization that impose a spurious wholeness on it. Another occurs later on, after Hester has spoken with Chillingworth about her decision to break her vow of secrecy. Hester has previously constructed for herself a noble, which is to say, unselfish explanation of the act she has decided to perform. Hester could not but ask herself whether there has not originally been a defect of truth, courage, and loyalty on her own part in allowing the minister to be thrown into a position where so much evil was to be foreboded. She determined to redeem her error so far as it might yet be possible. Nobody can disapprove, after all, of an act motivated by the desire to be true, courageous, and loyal. But after her interview with Chillingworth, Hester finds her mind in a turmoil, and other motives come to the surface. Her lively hatred of Chillingworth for having betrayed her into loveless marriage and cheated her of deserved happiness for one, her continued love for Dimmesdale, her living desire despite everything for an intimacy with him. The emotions of that brief space threw a dark light on Hester's state of mind, revealing much that she might not otherwise have acknowledged to herself. Yet even as hidden emotions come to the attention of the conscious mind, they continue to evade its control. For the first time since putting on the letter, Hester lies about it and grows harshly defensive with Pearl. And the narrator comments such behavior suggests that perhaps some new evil had crept into her heart, or some old one had never been expelled. When Hester, her patience at the end, threatens to shut Pearl into the dark closet, she is expressing in outward behavior the mental gesture of denying or suppressing the feelings that have revealed themselves to her, shutting them away with Pearl in the dark closet. The heart, as Hawthorne tells us often in his allegorical figures, is a cave or cellar where corpses have been buried, a closet where evil thoughts have been discarded. It is not only, as optimistic Americans would prefer to believe, the source of a fountain of pure feeling and innocent goodness. With Dimmesdale, whose mind is more fragile and more badly divided than Hester's, Hawthorne can more fully elaborate this model of the inner world. Dimmesdale, it might be said, operates in a continual state of extreme excitement. This is what is killing him. His regular fasting induces hallucinatory states. His brain often reeled and visions seemed to flit before him. Devils, angels, the dead friends of his youth, his parents, Hester and Pearl. These visions were the narrator's remarks, in one sense, the truest and most substantial things which the poor minister now dealt with. Yet even in his keyed up existence, there are peaks of much greater agitation, in particular, his secret penance on the scaffold, and his return from this forest after meeting Hester. The minister in a maid, and his return from the forest after meeting Hester. In both episodes, the minister's conscious mind becomes a passive receiver for images and impulses projected from lower mental depths. And in both, the images express a counterforce to the minister's continual effort to be good, to be perfect, to be better than anybody else has ever been. They reveal all the contrary impulses to be what we might today call normal. Dimmesdale interprets those impulses as evidence of evil, and we must interpret their eruption at the least as psychological breakdown. On the scaffold, Dimmesdale actually delights in the possibility that he may be discovered, even while, as the narrator comments, his behavior is a mockery in which his soul trifles with itself. As was the case with Hester on the scaffold earlier, the organizing power of the conscious mind, its ability to discriminate between inner and outer, important and trivial, disappears. Watching an approaching light, Dimmesdale sees it shine on a post, a garden fence, a pump, a water trough, an oak door, an iron knocker, noticing all these minute particulars, even while firmly convinced that the doom of his existence was stealing onward. As the night wears on, he comes close to hallucinating in a scene wherein the whole town rises up at dawn and comes running out to see him on the scaffold. Patriarchs in their nightgowns, Governor Bellingham with his rough askew, and young virgins of his parish who had made a shrine for Dimmesdale. In their white bosoms, which now, by the way, in their hurry and confusion, they would scantily have given themselves time to cover with the kerchiefs. Dimmesdale's desire to mock the decorum of the elders is expressed in his disrespectful images of their disarray. And his suppressed sexuality turns the young women of his parish into half-clothed groups. His unconscious mind reveals itself in irrelevant and disruptive jokes. Dimmesdale, assuming that the A-shaped comet has appeared especially as a message for him. Such an interpretation, according to the narrator, could only be the symptom of a highly disordered mental state, when a man, rendered morbidly self-contemplative by long, intense and secret pain, had extended his egotism over the whole expanse of nature until the ferment itself should appear no more than a fitting page for his soul's history and fate. The narrator prefigures here the condition that we would today call paranoia, the outward projection of obsession. The same processes are at work again in the scene of Dimmesdale's return from the forest. Once more, he is the passive and almost helpless spectator of his own forbidden and threatening impulses. This is much more dramatic scene than the meditation on the scaffold, for the minister has now taken a conscious, willful step towards rebellion. He is beset by appalling temptations. At every step he was incited to do some strange, wild, wicked thing or other, with a sense that it would be at once involuntary and intentional in spite of himself, yet growing out of a profounder self than that which opposed the impulse. Those desires, willed but resisted, recognized but denied, have an obvious aspect of disruptive humor about them. A wish to mock the puritanical code and his own submission to it. Dimmesdale wants to make blasphemous suggestions to an elderly, respectable deacon and a devout old widow, to make a lewd proposal to a young and beautiful parnisher, to teach dirty words to children, to trade obscene jokes with a sailor. Yet, if these impulses are funny and to a 20th century mind rather pathetic than wicked, there is no doubt that their emergence is not a sign of the minister's having won his emotional and mental freedom, but rather of his near approach to mental breakdown. To recognize divisions and conflicts in the mind, the presence of the repressed, the power of the unconscious, is not necessarily to become an advocate of what in the 20th century might call sincerity or authenticity. Nor does the narrator suggest that the newly revealed impulses are expressions of Dimmesdale's essential and natural goodness. On the contrary, he says firmly that these impulses represent scorn, bitterness, unprovoked malignity, gratuitous desires of ill, ridicule of whatever was good and holy. Examining Dimmesdale's hypocrisy in refusing to confess his sin, Hawthorne relies, just as he did in showing Hester's denied yet overwhelming passion for Dimmesdale, on concepts of such mental processes as self-delusion and rationalization. And he would lose this ability were his sin known. He stands up in the pulpit and delivers sermons calling himself a great sinner, and all the while knowing that these words will be interpreted figuratively by his listeners, and thus that far from revealing his sin, they will only further conceal it. Unable to assign a reason for his distrust and abhorrences of Chillingworth, he explains away these feelings as products of his general morbid state of mind. Although in Dimmesdale the self is more dangerously embroidered in civil war than it is in Hester. The dilemmas of both characters depend on concepts that, though Hawthorne lacks a modern vocabulary to label them, anticipate later psychological understanding. Notably too, Hawthorne makes no distinction between men and women in his depiction of mental processes. At this basic level of mind, there are no sexual differences. On the other hand, his representation of Hester, not so much of Dimmesdale, except by implication seems to assume innate psychological differences between men and women. To the extent that the Scarlet Letter claims our attention as a work of psychological analysis, this point needs to be persuaded. When Hawthorne uses the word man for Dimmesdale, it is generally no more than an empty identifier. Not so with the term woman for Hester. In her case, the word woman and its cognates seems to imply a specific female essence. Sometimes, to be sure, the word is used by characters who have their own individual or cultural ideas of sexual difference. Thus, when Hester first refuses to name her lover, Dimmesdale pays tribute to the wondrous strength and generosity of a woman's heart. Later, as Hester comes into favor with the townspeople through her behavior as a self-ordained sister of mercy, when they find her helpful, with power to do and power to sympathize, they praise her as strong with a woman's strength. But in chapter 13, titled Another View of Hester, the narrator studies her at length in light of what seems presented as an objective, trans-historical idea of womanhood. On the one hand, she appears to be faulted for having deviated from this ideal, even if she could not help herself. On the other, her good traits appears to be compatible with it. And we cannot fail to note that the worst result of Hester's 7-year isolation to this narrator appears to be her loss of beauty. Beauty that he describes as attractiveness to men. There seemed to be no longer anything in Hester's face for love to dwell upon. Nothing in Hester's form, though majestic and statue-like, that passion would ever dream of collapsing in its embrace. Nothing in Hester's bosom to make it ever again the pillow of affection, the narrator says, in a progression increasingly intimate from desire to sex to intimate slumber. And he sums it up. Some attribute had departed from her, the permanence of which had been essential to keep her a woman. This conclusion is reached even while it has been acknowledged that in her errands around town, her nature showed itself warm and rich, a wellspring of human tenderness. And even while her passionate devotion to Pearl is a constant motive in the narration. Thus, it can only be the power to inspire sexual desire in men that Hester has lost. This is what the narrator equates with her essential womanhood. And why is Hester no longer attractive to men? Almost certainly, in view of the narrator's elaboration of her freedom of thought and her independence, it is because she has become altogether self-reliant. Thus, we are faced with the irony that a woman is only herself a woman if she is an object of the amorous male regard. Womanhood and selfhood may be incompatible concepts. Hawthorne develops this paradox at precisely the era in American literary and cultural history when transcendentals were firmly preaching self-reliance to all and sundry, but at the same time allocating to women the role of dependent helpmate, thus indicating that self-reliance was for men only. In 1844, Margaret Fuller, whom Hawthorne came to know well while he lived at the Old Mason, wrote an essay on the topic, The Great Lawsuit, subsequently expanded into a book called Woman in the 19th Century, while is generally considered the earliest document in the American women's rights movement. Fuller argued passionately that until the transcendentalists expanded their message to include both sexes, their entire program was suspect. It is evident that Hawthorne has this and other early manifestations of feminism in mind, and that the question of a specifically female psychology was preoccupying him, as it would have too if he were seriously attempting to work with a female protagonist. The first women's right convention had been held in 1848, the year before he began to write the Scarlet Letter. His sister-in-law, Elizabeth Peabody, was a feminist. His wife, Sophia, was adamantly anti-feminist, and one of his sisters, Elizabeth, was feminist in inclination. The other, Maria Lucia, was not. Hawthorne is not de-integrating the quality of Hester's mind here, nor suggesting that women are incapable of thought and ought to leave reasoning to men. Nor is he intending to trivialize her strength, courage, and magnanimity. Indeed, the story cannot work without his recognizing these virtues. Yet, while Hawthorne makes Hester a real woman in all sorts of ways, he also seems to insist that she is not one. Some attribute had departed from her, the permanence of which had been essential to keep her a woman. Such is frequently the fate and such the stern development of the feminine character and person when the woman has encountered and lived through an experience of peculiar severity. Womanhood, then, is an inalienable essence that is nevertheless completely vulnerable. This contradiction implies that the idea of woman is a social construction and as such an additional burden on those human beings who must conform to it. The narrator's judgments of Hester vary according to whether she is seen as a person or as a woman, and vary even when she is seen only as a woman, strong with a woman's strength, with the wonderful strength and generosity of a woman's heart. Hester has yet ceased to be a woman. These inconsistencies are perhaps inevitable reflections of the debate over female psychology that the women's rights movement had precipitated and that has not yet been concluded. This episode comes to a climax with the appearance of a comet in the sky, whose array light shows the familiar scene of the street with the distinctness of midday, but also with the awfulness that is always imparted to familiar objects by an unaccustomed light. Here, three interpretive modes coverage: a naturalistic interpretation, in which the comet simply appears when it appears for reasons having to do with the movement of heavenly bodies; a social interpretation, whereby the Puritans together find a meaning in the comet pertinent to their infant commonwealth; and a private interpretation, which seems to symbolize the guilt that Nimsdale has been brooding in his heart, and also reflects closely on Hester's situation in this episode.